What's going on, everyone? This is James there with the world's last night. Today we are in Exodus chapter 34. It's been a long time since I posted, as usual, but we're still chugging along in Exodus. We actually only have a few more chapters left and then we'll be done. And then I think I've decided I'm going to skip Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy and pick it up in Joshua, then Judges, Ruth, Samuel. Basically get to all the writings because, man, they are very interesting. And when I'm done with the whole Bible, I'll probably come back and pick up the books that I decide to skip over. But in the interest of telling a story, I want to do it that way. So the story being basically God's plan for the redemption of humanity. And of course, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is quoted more by Jesus than any other book in the Old Testament. Like, these are important books. But, they take a little bit more study and they're a little bit more foreign to us because they're very law-based. So, again, chapter 34, verse 1, let's begin. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. Be prepared by morning. Come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. No one may go up with you. In fact, no one must be seen anywhere on the mountain. Even the flocks and herds are not to graze in front of that mountain." So Moses has repented. God's wrath has relented. And here the people of God are getting a second chance, which, that's in line with God's character. I think in the last podcast, I talked about how many times will God forgive you? If he demands you forgive your brother 7 times, 70 times, how much more is he going to forgive you for your sins? Well, here, even in the Old Testament, God is forgiving people. And this is an anachronism that people have about the Old Testament. They think it's God's very wrathful in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. And in fact, in college, I confronted someone who was trying to teach such a worldview in a Bible study. I had a group I used to belong to called Vols for Christ. And I remember I was in this group of probably 15 people. And the person who was doing the instruction was another college student, but they were in the ministry. And they were basically saying that God didn't have mercy in the Old Testament until Christ came. And I was like, do you even read the Bible? And what I cited to them was King David, who, after lusting after Bathsheba, after, sending his loyal servant to die so that he could take Bathsheba as his wife because he was married to her. He basically murdered that man to steal his wife, is what the end game is. There was judgment. I think it was Nathan the prophet basically came. God said, "I'm going to take your son." But there was also tons of mercy. I mean, the Old Testament, the law basically said if you commit adultery, you deserve to be stoned. Was David stoned? No. God relented. So the notion that God doesn't have mercy in the Old Testament is wrong. And here's a great example of that. Despite Israel's horrible idolatry, they repented, God forgave them, and he's again handing unto them the law, which will enable them to be a prosperous people if they follow it. So there's no difference. I hate this idea that somehow there's 2 different gods, one of the Old Testament, one of the New Testament. It's like, no, that's not it at all. Jesus is throughout, and Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. He just came to fulfill the law, and it cuts both ways. I mean, you look at something like capital punishment that God instituted in Genesis. It's still there even in the New Testament. Paul says that the government doesn't bear the sword for no reason, but is an agent of wrath for God upon the evildoer. In other words, saying the government has the capacity to take the life of man for their evil deeds, or a capital punishment, such as in Genesis it says, if you shed the blood of another man, then by man that person's blood shall be shed. There is tons of crossover between the two. It's not as if Jesus came to abolish the law. you can make that mistake. Jesus explicitly says he did not. He came to fulfill it. In other words, he kept every single precept of the law and lived a sinless life and made the righteous sacrifice for all of us for eternity. He is the high priest. He is also the sin goat that was sacrificed once a year, or actually not sacrificed, was the sins of the people, that of the sins that they committed that they didn't know, was put upon this goat and it was sent into the wilderness. So there's that misnomer where it's like the old law is completely done away with. You know, people usually try to do that to talk about like sexual immorality, to try to defend sexual immorality. So these people are wrong, right? But on the same regard, it's not like there was no mercy in the Old Testament, that there was no forgiveness in the Old Testament or anything like that, because God constantly, you'll see it's in his character, he's always been a merciful God, slow to anger, abounding in love. And here is a perfect example of that. All right, verse 2. Be prepared by morning. Come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. No one may go up with you. All right. Herds can't graze on the side of the mountain. Verse 4. Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. He got up early in the morning, and taking the 2 stone tablets in his hand, he climbed Mount Sinai, just as the Lord had commanded him. The Lord came down in a cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed his name, Yahweh. Then the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and rich in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving wrongdoing, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's wrongdoing on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Okay, I hate this term, but let me unpack that for you, said the youth pastor, right? This is actually saying exactly what I just said, that God describes himself as slow to anger, rich in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving wrongdoings, rebellion, and sin. This is exactly what he's doing here. But guys, this is probably the quintessential issue a postmodernist has when they approach this subject. You can't have God be perfectly merciful without him also being perfectly just. If God is the greatest conceivable being, it means that he is all loving, but he's also all just, also all holy, right? He perfectly encapsulates all of the greatest virtues at their highest point. So the second part, he says, but I'm not going to leave the guilty unpunished. You know, I'll bring the consequences on the father's wrongdoing, on the children and the grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, you and I, we don't like that. And in fact, in Scripture, God does away with that. In Scripture, eventually, he basically says, no, I'm just going to hold individuals accountable for their sin, and I'm not going to have this generational curse be put upon them to where I punish their children and their children's children. But at this point in time, this is how he's doling it out. And it's not like this generation that screwed God and worshipped a false idol is going to get away with their sin. Yes, he's compassionate and he returns the law to them, but they don't get to enter the promised land. They broke the covenant. They don't get to enter the promised land. Their children do, their children's children, Joshua's generation, which is the book I want to go to after Exodus, right? But even Moses himself, as we'll see towards the end of this, because of his sin, he doesn't get to enter the promised land. He just gets to see it. So it's not like your sin, even if it's forgiven, doesn't have consequences. You might be, commit adultery and sleep with a prostitute or something crazy like that. And God can forgive you of that sin, and even your spouse can forgive you of that sin. But you might still reap the consequences of that, which is you will have a distant relationship with your spouse. They won't trust you, and you may have contracted a venereal disease or something like that. Just because one can remove the guilt of sin or forgiveness for it doesn't mean that there's not consequences for it. I remember a pastor giving a sermon. He basically said that when he was growing up, he was in class, and I guess he was learning physics, and he had a really, I don't think he used the word dumb, but a kind of dumb classmate who was also wise in his own way. And the teacher was basically trying to say that, hey, 1,000 pounds of feathers weighs the same amount as 1,000 pounds of lead or whatever. And this guy just didn't understand that, this kid. And he kept saying, no, you're wrong, teacher, you're wrong. And the teacher's like, this is physics. This is correct. 1,000 pounds is 1,000 pounds. And the kid basically retorts. He says, well, let me hit you with 1,000 pounds worth of feathers, and then let me hit you upside the head with 1,000 pounds worth of lead, and you tell me which one weighs more. And of course, it's comedic because, well, the idea of the density difference is actually, we obviously know there's a difference between the density between that. Getting hit with a feather or getting hit with a pebble, one hurts way more. There's also, I guess, other physical properties that would change that, such as resistance, air resistance, and all that good stuff. But the pastor related this kind of funny story to an analogy between that, just because God views all sin as bad doesn't mean that some doesn't carry with it worse consequences than other. Some sin is like feathers. Some sin is like, getting hit with lead, and those consequences can stay with you. God's not going to remove those consequences. He didn't create a world where sticks, they catch fire when you want to keep warm. And when you build a house, they stand sturdy and strong. But when you go to beat someone with it, they turn into a limp noodle. No, it still can hurt someone. So God's set up a universe in such a way that your actions have real consequences. And you can do constructive actions like building a house out of lumber, or destructive ones like beating someone upside the head with a 2x4. The consequences still exist. I think that's what God is saying here. And even in the New Testament, it's not like we get off scot-free for our sins. It's not like God just said, oh, I just forgive it and it's all forgiven. No, Jesus Christ had to die. There was a consequence, a grievous, horrendous consequence for our sin. It took the suffering and death of Jesus, an innocent person, innocent Son of God, to alleviate it. Not only that, but then the spiritual consequences of God's wrath being poured out upon Christ when it rightfully belonged upon us. The consequences were still there. We just had someone that paid a debt for us. That's all. Someone had to still pay the debt for justice to be done. Okay, verse 8. Moses immediately bowed down to the ground and worshipped. Then he said, my Lord, if I have indeed found favor in your sight, my Lord, please go with us. Even though this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wrongdoing and sin, and accept us as your own possession. That's a great prayer. And I believe that God responds to a contrite heart like that. Stiff-necked people. They're stubborn. And at least Moses is admitting it. All right, verse 10. And the Lord responded, look, I am making a covenant. I will perform wonders in the presence of all your people that have never been done in all the earth or in any nation. All the people you live among will see the Lord's work, for what I am doing with you is awe-inspiring. Observe what I command you today. I'm going to drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land that you are going to enter. Otherwise, they will become a snare among you. This is so important, especially when we get into the book of Joshua, when they actually enter the promised land. If you remember, let's rewind quite some time. Roughly 400 years ago, God is saying that Abraham's not going to come into the promised land because, not yet, he's going to wait 400 years because the full measure of the sin of these people who he just listed has not come to bear. In other words, they haven't become so evil and so corrupt that they are beyond redemption. But one day they will, and this day has come. And God is basically saying, you're going to enter this land and you're going to have these horrendous cultures. You're going to have people who, when they, like the Babylonians, eventually the Babylonians, right? This becomes a people who wage war against Israel. But, when they captured a new country, they would sometimes even put a hook in people's mouths, the slaves they took, and then haul them off. They would take out all the skilled labor and send them into a diaspora, right? So all that's left is poverty. Like, some of these nations, these pagan nations, were not good. They weren't kind. They weren't just. Some of them worshipped Molech. Molech is a demon god. They would craft this, I think it was made out of iron, statue with hands put out that they would heat up. They would light a fire under it or in it and heat it up, and then they would place their babies on these hands who would basically fry on these hands of this statue that they worshiped, and they would sacrifice their children to it. These are not good, God-honoring people, and God is 400 years later finally fed up enough with their sin. That is actually very slow to anger, but he's finally there, and he's sending Israel into this land to take it as their possession from all these other peoples who were given life, they were given prosperity, and they squandered it, and they failed to steward it. And you and I better believe that God will do the same thing to us, to our families, to our nation, if we behave the same way. He will straight up take your life if you squander it. Just like the man in the New Testament in the proverb, he said, hey, I've made all these riches. I've worked hard. I've got all these riches. I've stored up my whole barn. I have everything I could ever need. Let me build another barn and fill it up with all kinds of riches. What does Jesus say in the parable? It says that God called that man a fool and that his life would be demanded of him that very night. Do not squander what God gives you. If you have great wealth, make sure you share it. And I'm not preaching socialism. I am so far from a socialist at this point in my life. When I was in high school, I was a socialist, but at this point in my life, I'm so far from it. But altruism, 100% Christian charity and giving. Charity is a terrible word for that, by the way. Charity means something totally different than what people ascribe to it. But, Christian giving is a wonderful thing, and it should be done. So don't squander what God's given you. And that doesn't just include money, that includes time and everything else. Or he might demand it from you. Okay, so he's going to drive these people out. Their lives are being demanded. Be careful not to make a treaty. That's important, guys, because later on, Israel gets hoodwinked by one of them. They make a treaty with one of these tribes. Instead, you must tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, chop down their Asherah poles, which was used to worship a god. You are to never bow down to another god, because the Lord, being jealous by nature, is a jealous God. Two things, and I think I've talked about one of these, but the reason these people would be a snare to Israel is because they would convince Israelites to worship false gods, and God knows that, well, as Proverbs says, bad company corrupts good character. This is also why they had a rule against intermarriage between faiths. It's even why today, even in the New Testament, Paul says, do not be unequally yoked, which means if you can keep from it, try not to marry someone who is an unbeliever because, well, you're unequally yoked. You have different everything. Priorities, which is a huge thing, but even like your first love, they won't understand why you must put God before them. So, and that's not to say if you're married to an unbeliever, you should divorce. Paul says, don't do that. He does say if the unbeliever decides to walk away and divorce, let them, But in any case, this is one of the snares that these people would have is basically unbelievers influencing the Israelites to worship these false pagan gods. And then the second thing is it says God's jealous by nature. Well, there's a difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy means you have a right to something. God has a right to our worship. Envy is whenever you want something you do not have a right to. Back to being a socialist. That is the epitome of envy. It's like, my neighbor's wealthy. I want what he has. It's like, irregardless of whether my neighbor earned that or not, I'm envious of it and I want it. You have no right to it. So that's the difference between envy and jealousy. Verse 15, do not make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land, or else when they prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, they will invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifice. Then you will take some of their daughters as brides for your sons. Their daughters will prostitute themselves with their gods, and cause your sons to prostitute themselves with their gods. And then he goes on to say, do not make cast images of gods for yourselves. Verse 18, observe the festival of the unleavened bread. You are to Eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib, as I commanded you, for you came out of Egypt in the month of Abib. Festival of the unleavened bread, if you remember, God basically told them not to bring any leavening yeast with them when they made this bread, when they were leaving Egypt. So it's sort of to commemorate that. They're doing that every 7 years. There is an important part of tradition. I wish there were some more traditions that Americans practiced. Even Christians, religiously speaking, like I love how the Catholics have Advent. Like us Protestants, we don't really have anything like that. We could definitely do with some more traditions to remember things. One of the things that I'm doing with my family right now is we created a rock garden on our property, and we have these stones with engravings of things God has done for us. And the reason I did this was because I wanted my children and my children's children to reflect and see all the great things God has done in their family, because they won't know or they'll forget, but this way they can read it and they can say, oh wow, that's what God did in 2018. Like God healed my grandmother of cancer in 2018, or God healed my mother of PPD in 2017, or whatever year that was. Basically, I do think like having these festivals or traditions or remembrances is a very important part of culture, and I wish that we practiced more of it. I wish we had something better for the 4th of July than fireworks to remember our founding. But that is what it is. Verse 19, the firstborn male from every womb belongs to me, including all your male livestock, the firstborn of cattle or sheep. You must redeem the firstborn of a donkey with a sheep, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. You must redeem all the firstborn of your sons. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. So the redemption, okay, so a lot of these livestock, the firstborn would be sacrificed. And it's an act of faith, right? First, God commands you to do it. It's like the tithe. He gets the first. First, God commands you to do it. So it's an act of obedience. But secondly, it's an act of faith, because if you kill the firstborn of your livestock that you waited for, I don't know how many months for you to have like another livestock animal, you've essentially destroyed part of your livelihood. And you are hoping that your livestock will have another, baby or set of babies, after the first one that you can actually start making some profit on, or eat, or milk, or whatever kind of livestock it is. The faith is that, hey, if I offer this one to God, I have faith that God's going to keep providing for me, even though I'm giving up my quote-unquote source of provision. It's really a lesson in where does your provision come from? Does it come from your job, or does it come from God? My life, I've understood this for several years now, that my money doesn't come from my job when I was full-time. It doesn't come from my clients. It comes from my God, who owns all the currency in the entire world. How he gets it to me, it changes. But I must recognize always that it comes from God. So you have faith whenever you sacrifice these animals, the firstborn, that God's going to provide for you, even if it's not through that same livestock that had the firstborn. Maybe they never have a secondborn, but you have faith that God's going to provide for you another way. Now, some animals, it looks like the donkey can be redeemed with a sheep, so you can kill a sheep. And, of course, you don't kill your firstborn son. You redeem your firstborn son. And there's different ways to do this. I forget if it's money or sacrificing different animals or whatever. But firstborn belongs to God no matter what. All right. Verse 21, you are to labor 6 days, but you must rest on the 7th day. You must even rest during the plowing and harvesting times. So this is another way to commemorate how God created the world. He created it in 6 days. You rested on the 7th. Whether or not they are literal days or time periods doesn't matter. It's symbolic. The Sabbath is symbolic either way. And there's some things to this. Like Allie and I have talked about this. Like she wants to start celebrating the Sabbath as a family, and literally have a day that's like dedicated to worship and family, and we don't work at all. And, that kind of works. Our culture is a little weird in that we only work 5 days a week. Scripturally, you're supposed to work 6 days a week. We only work 5. We have a whole day off, 2 days off. And we only worship God on Sunday. So there's some interesting things there. But in the New Testament, what I love that Jesus says, because he heals this man on the Sabbath, and Pharisees are like, oh my gosh, you healed a man on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And the man he healed is carrying his mat on the Sabbath, and they're like, no, you can't do that. Carrying is work. It's like these people just have taken the law to such a like atomized, infinitesimal, concept of it that it's made living impossible. And they come to Jesus and they're like, "Why are you doing this, man?" And Jesus is like, "Look," and he says this, and it's very poignant. He says, "Sabbath was created for man. Man wasn't created for Sabbath." In other words, man doesn't worship Sabbath. But Sabbath is created to serve man. It's your day to rest, and it's an act of humility because you are human and you need rest. There's some pretty freakishly workaholic people out there in the universe, like Elon Musk. The man works 100-hour weeks, which I don't know if I've ever hit that in my life. And I've worked some pretty nutso weeks. Probably 80 hours is probably the most I've ever worked in a week. But, eventually you get to the point where you go crazy. Like, you need sleep. It's humbling that you need sleep. God doesn't sleep. You do. And so God made the Sabbath for man. And, in the Old Testament, he's commanding it. I guess because they're just too thick or whatever. They're too desperate. They think they need to keep working on those days, including harvesting or whatever, or else they're going to starve. And I think God is really saying that, hey, this is actually a time where you can connect with me. You can rest. And I don't want you to think that you're not going to be provided for if you do this. And it's for your good. So Sabbath is one of those things that has sort of evolved with Jesus fulfilling the law. We talked about things that didn't change and, going both directions. But this is one thing that there was a spiritual truth to it that by the time the Pharisees in the New Testament were talking about it, got lost in translation. Okay, verse 22, observe the festival of weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the agricultural year. 3 times a year all your males are to appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel. For I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your territory. No one will covet your land when you go up 3 times a year to appear before the Lord your God. Honestly, don't know what the appearing before them is about. Sounds like it's like, hey, get 3 times a year. You're supposed to get all the men together and you're going to go to war. That's what it sounds like to me. But I honestly don't know. That's something to look up. All right. But basically, these all come with promises. It's basically saying, if you do this, you're going to be prosperous. All right. Do not present the blood for my sacrifice with anything leavened. The sacrifice of the Passover festival must not remain until morning. You got to eat it, just like they did during the Exodus of the Passover. They had to eat everything, and things they didn't eat, I think they had to burn before the morning. Verse 26, bring the best first fruits of your land to the house of the Lord your God. You must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Interesting stuff. The Lord also said to Moses, write down these words, for I have made a covenant with you and with Israel based on these words. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water. He wrote down on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. So he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, which is exactly what Jesus did in the desert in the New Testament when he was, preparing himself for his ministry and he was being tempted by Satan. Very interesting parallels. Moses sort of being a forerunner or a type for Christ in that regard. Okay. This next part's pretty cool too. Verse 29, as Moses descended from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands as he descended the mountain, he did not realize that the skin of his face shone as a result of his speaking with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face shone. They were afraid to come near him. But Moses called out to them. So Aaron... Okay, sorry, I got interrupted there, but they were afraid to come near him, but Moses called out to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he commanded them everything the Lord had told them on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever Moses went before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. After he came out, he would tell the Israelites what he had been commanded. And the Israelites would see that Moses' face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went to speak with the Lord. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. Let me talk about this whole shiny face bit. What I love about Christianity, and it's what separates it from Eastern religion, is that matter is good. God made creation and he called it good. It means whiskey is good. It means fruit is good. It means the human body is good. Now, all these things can be corrupted. The human body can be misused. Whiskey can be overdrunk. I forget what else I said. Maybe I said fruit. You can overeat, right? But in general, if it's used properly, it's good, and it can be done so for the worship of God. Now, in Eastern religions, you put off the body. This idea of Moses' face shining and being radiant is actually somewhat anathema for like a Buddhist, mindset. An interesting thing G.K. Chesterton, commented on was that if you look at old paintings of Buddhist monks, their eyes are always shut and they're looking inward. And you can Google image this; it's kind of interesting. But if you look at old paintings of old Christians, of old Christians, their eyes are like wider than possible, and they're always like looking heavenward. They're looking out, and that sort of separates the whole idea of these two different concepts. One is looking outward of itself. The other one is looking inward. One is trying to, find harmony with God and how He made matter, and the other one is trying to shirk and get rid of the flesh. So Moses' face shining, to me, is a beautiful thing because it means that the spiritual impacts the physical. It isn't that we have a spiritual life and a physical life and a mental life and an emotional life. These are all intertwined, and that's how God made it. We are an amalgamation of these things. C.S. Lewis called us an amphibian, actually, with spirit and body. Whenever you are resurrected into heaven or New Jerusalem after your death, you're given a body. It's a new glorified body, is how Paul writes about it. Now, the shining of the face also reminds me of Stephen in the New Testament. If you read in the book of Acts, the very first martyr, and a martyr is someone who's killed for their faith. The very first martyr is the disciple Stephen, and he's stoned to death. And the author of Acts, which would be Luke, basically writes a note and says that his face shone when he was being stoned. And so that's what I kind of relate it to. Stephen had such a connection with the divine that even as he was being murdered, his face was radiant. So that's one way to look at this, and one way to sort of just think about it and sort of go off on a tangent as far as how does the spiritual interact with the physical. But another practical thing for this to be is that anytime Moses comes back from speaking with God, like his face is shining, and so these people, they know that he has been with God. It's like this reassurance. It's credibility. There's a lot of false prophets out there. A lot of false prophets. It's hard to take people at their word, especially when they say, I spoke to God, or God told me this. Now, but it's a little bit more credible if the person who's talking to you has some sort of physical attribute about them where you're like, oh my gosh, there's like the radiant presence of God on this man's face. So I can trust that this man has actually been speaking face to face with God. And I use that term as sort of a metaphor, but in any case, that's what I think that this is what this meant to Israelites. It meant that Moses was authentic. So that is it for chapter 34. We got 35, 36. How much more could possibly be left? It goes through chapter 40. So I'm stoked to finish this up. Am I going to skip anything else? Probably not. I'll probably just finish this straight. I did have a funny interaction with a friend. He basically, one day, totally unprovoked, was like, hey, what are you reading? I'm like, Exodus. He's like, oh man, my favorite chapter is so-and-so. And it happened to be one of the chapters I skipped over in this podcast. But it was interesting. He basically said the reason he loved it is because it showed that artists, which he's a filmmaker, it shows that artists and craftsmen have a special purpose. Like they can use these abilities that God has given them to then worship God. And so that's why that chapter, it was probably like instruction on how to build the temple or the ark or something like that. But that's why that chapter meant so much to him. I thought it was really ironic that I skipped over it. So sorry His name is Paige. Sorry, Paige, if you listen to this podcast and I disappointed you. So in that same vein, my dad retired this week. He's an architect. And, one of the things I told him was that, you used your gift for 43 years in your career worshiping God because what you did was for the glory of God and it provided for your family. And it's just it's so interesting. You can use what God has given you or you can squander it. And my dad used what God gave him this artistic ability of architecture. He didn't squander it. He made a career of 43 years out of it. And there's buildings all across America because of his work. So that's kind of totally off topic. You can sort of trace that tangent back. So next time we'll be in chapter 35, unless I decide to do a topical podcast. Until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.